take on and debate these ideas. So we have Lawrence Vivek, also known as the, did I say that right? Free market warrior here for the Tea Party. We have Jesse Lessinger, an organizer for a socialist alternative in New York City. Now, they'll each be given 10 minutes each, and then 5 minutes each. Then it'll be open to a 30-minute discussion, and then they'll have 5 minutes on mouth each. All right, so I think we can get started. Jesse's going to go first.
Microphone here. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to start by thanking Mr. Vivek and everyone for coming here this evening to this very important debate, which was actually just an elaborate scheme photograph Mr. Vivek shaking hands with the Socialist. On the website. The free market has been an utter failure. Global capitalism, which is the same thing, essentially. It's a global system, and it's failed to solve any of the major problems that we face in the world today. World poverty and hunger has been on the rise. We have mass and chronic unemployment for hundreds of millions of people. In the U.S., infrastructure is crumbling. Over 50 million people in this country have no health care. The real unemployment rate, if you include the underemployed, is at 20%. We see an eroding of our democratic rights, and the whole planet threatened by ecological and environmental disaster. The recent BP spill bringing this once again to light, and it was a clear result of deregulation and government turning a blind eye to the adventures of a big corporation, this is a tendency which is built in to this system based on capitalist or free market competition. And it's this competition that has businesses cutting corners, disregarding safety regulations, disregarding the environment. It chases businesses over every stretch of the world in search of quick profits at all costs. It produces vast inequality where in this country, the top 1% owns more wealth than the entire bottom 90%. And they gain this by appropriating, by taking for themselves the fruits of somebody else's labor. That is the wealth produced by this other 90%, or more like 80 or 70% that actually has work. Because believe it or not, it's working people that do the work. And of course, the bosses do the bossing, and the owners do a good job at the owning. But sometimes this inequality and exploitation provokes resistance. So they pass laws, they set up courts, they hire police, they build prisons, they build a big military to keep anybody from challenging this inequality, challenging the status quo, challenging their system. And their system is a global one, but the laws and the courts and the police and the prisons and the military are based on national boundaries. So they're constantly fighting over the resources and the markets, how to divide up the resources and the markets of the world. And sometimes this conflict can't be solved in any other way but war. And this conflict, this global competition becomes so intense, they have to keep growing and growing and getting more and more profits and producing more and more and more, and having workers work harder and harder and having them be paid less and less. They need bigger and bigger markets. Meanwhile, there's a whole group of people that are just in the middle, wheeling and dealing and trading and gambling, making their own cut. This is Wall Street I'm talking about, the financial markets. Artificially inflating prices like the housing market, parasitically sucking wealth upwards without producing any of that wealth themselves, creating huge inequality, huge imbalances, and these imbalances, this competition becomes so intense that suddenly we produce more than what working people can buy back, and we've maxed out our credit cards and so on, and this entire scheme of expansion breaks down and enters into a deep crisis. But the ruling elite, they don't want to be blamed for this crisis. So if we get really angry at one of their parties that they have in their back pocket, they'll present us with another party and tell us it's changed. And they'll tell us the people that are who are really there to blame are people with a different skin color from us, people that speak a different language, maybe come from a different country, have a different religion, and they teach us to hate each other instead of hating them. And this, of course, comes in very handy when it's time to convince working people to get behind their government to go to war against working people in another country. So this crisis-prone system is one which breeds war and breeds racism and breeds discrimination and xenophobia and sexism and creates environmental destruction and mass poverty. All the while, there's a thin layer at the top that's sitting pretty, that's in control, and is reaping all the benefits. In a word, these people are the mismanagers of society, and it's time to take society out of their hands. So the bankers, these mismanagers, whose reckless behavior have helped create the crisis, obviously should not get a bailout. In fact, they shouldn't be allowed to run the banks. There are simple rules in life. You don't give little children sharp objects. The banks, instead, should be run by the public, should be owned by the public and run democratically in our interest so that no one has to lose their homes, so that we can invest this huge wealth into things we need, like infrastructure and public transit and renewable energy. And why stop at the banks, right? Why not take it out of the hands of all the mismanagers of the oil and energy industry, telecommunications, transportation, construction, manufacturing, and so on, bring this under public ownership, democratic control. I'm not talking about small business. I'm talking about the big companies. And there will be more than enough wealth and resources to employ everyone who wants a job. And not only that, we were talking about jobs, building schools and hospitals, high-speed trains, solar power, employing and training more teachers, more nurses, more engineers, scientists, to take society forward. And this is essentially the main part of the socialist program for the crisis. This is what we mean by socialism. Obama is not a socialist. Bailing out the banks is not socialism. You could call it socialism for the rich, but that's not socialism at all, right? Welfare for big corporations and massive cuts for the masses is the opposite of what socialists say. Now, the Tea Party folks, they go on about big government being the problem. And, well, they're right that the present capitalist government is a problem. But they often confuse who's pulling the strings. It's big business which runs and dominates and influences big government, not the other way around, because they're the ones funding and backing these two parties. So it's the interests of big business that the two parties are representing. And the bigger these corporations and more global that they get, and the bigger inequality and imbalances they create, the more of a bigger government and bureaucracy and military that they need to keep things under wraps. So socialists are also opposed to big government bureaucracies as well. And what the former Soviet Union became is something that we call Stalinism, not socialism. It doesn't prove that socialism is inherently totalitarian. The Soviet Union, after the First World War, was underdeveloped. It remained isolated. It faced intense pressure and hostility from the capitalist world. And it was under these conditions, specific conditions, it degenerated, and a parasitic bureaucracy emerged and mismanaged that economy because there's no democratic checks on that economy. That's why it eventually stagnated and collapsed. But even so, it should be noted that when these poorly planned economies fell, and the free market is what came to replace it, that it led to a historically unprecedented decline in living standards in those regions. So socialists are completely opposed to totalitarian dictatorships. In fact, historically, socialists have been at the forefront of fighting for democratic rights, fighting for voting rights and women's rights, free speech, and the rights to form unions. What we call for is actually a more democratic society. If you look at the workplace under capitalism, boss calls all the shots. That sounds like a dictatorship to me. So socialism is a planned economy where you have real workplace democracy, and that's what can provide a check on corruption and mismanagement. And in this way, the wealth is actually in the hands of the people that produce it. But under this system, instead, we have a situation where the wealth is undemocratically controlled. Massive wealth. The wealthy have now hoarded $10 trillion of liquid assets. That's not tied up into investments and stocks. That's cash. And meanwhile, you have millions and millions of people that are unemployed, that want jobs, that are ready to work. Some of them have skills. But in any rational society, we would take that cash and employ those millions of people in useful jobs and make things better for the benefit of everyone. But that doesn't happen now. They don't invest now because investment is not driven by social need. Under capitalism, it's based on profit. And they're too afraid to invest right now because there's no profit to be made. And this is despite the best efforts of the government to say, no, we've got your back. We will take on all your $1 trillion of losses. We're going to take all that on. It's okay to invest. Don't worry. We've got your back. We'll prop you up. And they still won't invest. And instead, what the investors and the bankers, essentially what the markets want, I'm finishing on this point. What they're not worried about is that the government deficits, which have ballooned because we've taken on their bad mistakes, they're worried about these deficits, so what they're asking for is for us to pay. By cutting our social priorities, our hard-earned social programs, what they want is the overwhelming burden of this crisis to be placed on our shoulders, to be our burden, and I say enough is enough. We don't need free market. We need freedom from the market.